Good day, Milers, and welcome to video number 5, the final video on the build of my Giant Stinger from Carolina Custom Kits. Now so far, we've managed to take a box of wood and turn it into an ARF. Now we're going to take that ARF and turn it into an airplane that's ready to take to the skies. So let's get into it. First up, we need to finish the wings. I started by epoxying the hinges for the ailerons into both wing halves. For this plane, I am using these great fiberglass control horns I found at Extreme Flight. First, I marked and cut slots for the control horns using these fiberglass plates that came with them, and then glued the horns and plates to each aileron. Once everything was in place, I removed the tape, leaving a clean finish and let everything cure. With those all set, it was time to mix up another batch of epoxy and glue each aileron to the correct wing half. The plane would look rather silly if you got them backwards. Finish up by making sure you have full control movement and clean up any excess epoxy. Next, I mounted both aileron servos and made both control rods for the wings. Looking good. After finishing the wings, I went ahead and mounted the elevators and rudders using the exact same techniques and hooked up the servos. Then I mounted the tail wheel and main landing gear, so we're ready to move on to the engine. After doing the customary tail wiggle, of course. So the next thing we want to do is get everything ready to mount the engine, which you can see I have temporarily mounted right here. The first thing I like to do is cut any holes in the firewall that need to be done. So as you can see down in here, the kit already has one for the fuel and vent lines. And what I've done is mark two more that we're going to need. The first one right here is for the ignition wires to come through. From the ignition, it's going to be mounted in the bottom of the fuselage. And then the other one is right here, and that's where the throttle push rod is going to come through and run to the throttle arm, which is right there. So what I'm going to do now is remove the engine, cut those holes, and start running the throttle push rod. Okay, so the throttle servo is all installed and ready to go, and it was pretty straightforward. First, I glued in the two wooden rails that the servo is screwed to, and then I went ahead and installed the push rod, and you can see the blue guide tube and the yellow push rod. They go all the way through forward to the firewall to where the engine's going to be, and then I just fabricated that plywood mount. One thing you want to make sure of when you're using a gasoline engine is that you use a flexible push rod for the throttle so that it can absorb the vibrations of the engine. And so that is good to go. So with the throttle all sorted, the next thing we want to do is move on to the electrical systems. This plane actually has two separate electrical systems, one for the main receiver and then a separate one that runs the ignition. Now as you can see, I've cut two holes in the fuselage, and that's for the two separate switches that run both the main system and the ignition. So the first thing I'm going to do is work on mounting the main flight battery pack, which is going to go right up in the front right here. So I'm going to get working on that. Okay, I'm just about ready to install the receiver pack, and I wanted to show you guys a little trick you can do to give yourself some free redundancy. And it's one of the reasons I love these Lifey receiver packs from Spektrum, because generally they come with two separate outputs. So what you can do, and what I'm doing, is I'm using one of these great Miracle switches. It's basically two independent switches in one unit. So you hook up each one of the leads coming off of your battery into each one of those switches, and then you have two separate leads going in your receiver. And what this will do is you won't lose power if one of your switches goes bad, but also it gives your receiver double the amps to work with, so that will prevent a brownout in case you have an amp spike from one of your servos if you're doing like a Lumshevak or a tumbling maneuver that tends to do a lot of amps real quick. So it's a little hard to see, but that is the main battery mounted way up in the front, all good to go, and we put it as far up as we can for CG. And then it's wired into the nice Miracle switch, which is right there. And everything turned out great. Now originally, I was planning on using the fuel filter that's built in on the Miracle switch, but I didn't like the idea of it going in between all the wires. So what I ended up doing was installing a separate one on the other side of the fuselage. So that'll be our fuel filler. And that kept the wires nice and clean, and they go all the way back, and there's the two leads that will go to the receiver when all is said and done. Now the other thing I did is I installed the electronic ignition, which is down underneath this plate. You can't see it, but it's down there. And that means the last part of the electrical system will go right there where my hands are, the bottom battery hatch, which is right here, and that holds the ignition battery. and the optical kill switch. So that mounts from up underneath, and then everything for the engine will be good to go, and you can see it also is mounted and ready to go. And once all that is done, then we get to paint the cowl, finally. For the cowl, I started with 2 coats of primer, and then did 3 coats of color, and finally 2 coats of clear to make it nice and shiny. Okay, so here's a little quick tip for you. If you have a bigger plane like this that has separate servos for each elevator, this is an easy way to get them to work in unison. So you'll notice on this plane, you go down, they pretty much stay even the whole way. But when you go up, watch how much higher the right elevator goes than the left. And you can really see it right there, right? So what you do is you take a carbon rod, same size, attach one to each elevator, just tape it down and get them to meet in the middle. And then pretty much every radio nowadays has a way to mix them together, and so you just make the one that doesn't move as far, in this case the left elevator, your master, and make the one that has more movement your slave, and then do a mix. In this case I did a 9-point curve mix. Now going down, I really didn't have to do much. I added 1 or 2% throughout the points, but going up, I had to change them, and now they stay perfectly aligned all the way through their movement. Just finished up the receiver installation. You can see everything is all organized nice, and making sure there's no tension on any of the wires. And so all we gotta do is button up the engine compartment. Okay, fuel system is ready to go. You can see the tank installed. This is the fill line, curls around and comes out to the filler valve right here. And then this is our vent line, and then our main feed line both run through the front and come out right down there. You can see the vent line comes up. We have an air trap, and then it curls down and goes out of the bottom right there. We'll go out the cowl, and then you can see the feed line going to the carb, all nice and secured and ready to go. So next up, we do the final fitting of the cowl and then check the CG. Okay, just did the test fitting of the cowl prop and spinner, and everything is really good, except we have to make one minor tweak. Now it's hard to see, but the cutout around the servo cap is just a little bit too small, so I'm going to have to Dremel that out just a touch. I measured it for the spark plug itself and not the cap, forgetting that the cap has about a 1mm lip. So I've got to expand that just a little bit, and then we are ready to attach the wings and CG and weigh this baby. Well, as you know, we cover both the good and the bad on this channel. And when I went to CG the Stinger, we ran into a little bit of the bad, because the CG was about an inch rear of what I was expecting. And the last thing you want on a maiden is a twitchy, tail-heavy airplane. Now, I was able to add nose weight to get the CG back where I wanted, but I absolutely hate unnecessary additional weight. So I decided to go through the entire airplane and see if there was anything at all that I could move forward that would allow me to remove some of that weight. And I found a couple things. Okay, so here's the first change I made. Now originally, the ignition battery was mounted right here, and then the ignition itself was back behind it. So what I did is I took the ignition battery, and you can see it, I moved it up in front of the firewall, which then allowed me to take the ignition itself and move it up to where the ignition battery was. And those two together weigh 9 ounces. So we're able to move 9 ounces of weight about 4 inches forward. So that should help out with our CG quite a bit. Well, let's keep working. Okay, I just finished the second big change, which was the rudder servo was originally mounted back here with the elevator servos, and it was a pushrod configuration. What I did was I removed all of that and moved the rudder servo all the way up here into the fuselage and switched it to a pull-pull cable system. Now what that allows me to do is remove 8 ounces of lead from the nose, so it was definitely worth all the hard work. Okay, so the last change is done, and that was changing out the heavy aluminum landing gear that came with this plane for these carbon fiber ones, which weigh about 6 ounces less. So now we're ready to CG and weigh the plane. Alright guys, I just finished reweighing and checking the CG on the Giant Stinger after the changes, and we were able to keep the CG exactly where it was before while removing over a pound of unnecessary weight. That is over 5% of the total weight of this plane, so that should make a huge difference in performance. So now we are finally ready to fire up that engine, so look for that in the next video.